So our next speaker, Jessica Kazembe, senior developer here at ThoughtWorks, she actually joined us in Australia and then moved to the US. She is an American, so she had just been doing her travels when she joined ThoughtWorks. I've worked with her in the past on web development projects, e-commerce. She continues to work in that space and has built up a fair amount of expertise. And she's going to share a lot of her learnings working with large-scale micro front-end applications. So Jessica, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Brandon. So as Brandon mentioned, my name is Jessica Kazembe. I'm a senior consultant here at ThoughtWorks. And I just wanted to talk about micro front ends in practice and should I use it for my project? So before we answer that question, I wanted to define what is a micro front end. The term actually came up in ThoughtWorks technology radar back in 2016, and it's basically a microservice that exists within a browser. So it extends the concepts of microservices to the front end. However, um, we want to think about how were microservices actually formed. So to give a little background of that, I want to go through the evolution of microservices. So first we started with a monolith application. This is where we would have developers on teams that usually were full stack um, because they were cross-functional. They worked within the code base that touched every layer of the application, front end, back end, and database. We also would use design patterns like model view controller to manage the application structure. But all in all, it was generally one team within one code base. From here, we moved um, to a structure where we separated the front end from the back end. Um, and with this separation, it ended up allowing the developers to focus either on the front end side or the back end side. And they started to become specialized in these areas. And they weren't as cross functional as they were before in the monolith. Then eventually, on the back end side, we started to realize that it was starting to become large, similar to the monolith that we saw before. So as developers, we thought, how can we break this up some more? And that's where microservices came about. In this design, the front end would communicate with the microservices through an aggregate layer where we could use things like BFFs, backends for the front end, or GraphQL to make that connection. And in the backend side, the microservices would just serve as specific areas of the backend that were specialized for a specific service. And teams could be responsible for various different services on the back end. So these applications that we have today are actually starting to have more and more logic and functionality on the front end. And we're finding ourselves in a similar situation as we did on the back end, where the front end is becoming somewhat of a monolith of itself. So we're at a similar crossroads. And we start that is where we're starting to begin to think of micro front ends. So how do we apply that microservices concept to the front end? I want to discuss two possible ways in which that could be done. One way is to have micro front end teams. So similar to how the back end was split up into very specific services, we can do the same thing with front ends. So, a front end could be specialized in or specific to a particular page within the website that a team focuses on, or it could be common components within the website. So, for example, you have things like the header and the footer that are on all pages or on multiple pages. So that could be its own micro front end as well. And each one of those front end applications would interact with the various microservices in the back end as they need it through the aggregate layer. Another approach is to have end-to-end teams with micro front ends. So the idea here is to think about your website or web application as a composition of features where each is owned by independent teams. Each team is cross-functional and they have a distinctive area of business that they specialize in. In this model, the teams would be cross-functional and work on features that are from end to end. So they would touch everything from the database all the way to the user interface. But no matter which one of these architecture designs that you decide to choose for your micro front ends, I feel there are two important characteristics that you should ensure that you uphold when you're creating these micro front ends. First, you should be technology agnostic. So each team should be able to choose and upgrade their tech stack without having to coordinate with other teams. No matter which of the architectures that I described before, um, your micro front end should have the ability to have its own tech stack without affecting other parts of the application. So as you see here in this example, you can have a given page where different teams are responsible for different parts of that page, but each team is using their own technology, their own tech stack, and it doesn't affect the other components or the other micro front ends on the page. So having this characteristic is an important thing that you should consider when you're separating these micro front ends. Another characteristic is that the team code should be isolated. Basically, it should not share runtime, even if all the teams are using the same framework. There should be independent applications that are self-contained. So what that looks like is basically with each one of our micro front ends, they should have their own build and test pipeline. They should be able to deploy a standalone application to production and be isolated from all of the other teams without involving the other micro front ends and be able to build and develop their individual micro front ends independent of each other. And once each team has their features or um, their development complete, then they can add it to the larger application container with the rest of the micro front ends. So this isolation should allow you to be able to deploy your micro front end on its own without having to worry about the other parts of the site. So as you see here, as we discussed before, we have this application where different teams are responsible for different parts of the page. We should also be able to get rid of some of these parts and just focus on our team or your team's micro front end in a standalone version as well. So there are a few benefits of creating micro front ends. Individual dev teams can choose their own tech stacks. This allows teams to use whatever tech stack that works for them and their team, and they're not necessarily confined to using what the organization uses as a whole or as a norm. Sometimes certain tech stacks work better with certain types of features or certain things that you're trying to build on the site, or it could just be simply a learning curve for some people. Like maybe a different tech stack is better for that particular team. You can do that with the micro front ends. It also helps with continuous development, and testing becomes a lot more simpler. And lastly, making changes becomes easier because you're focusing just on this small piece of the application. You're not worrying about touching other parts that are unrelated to the features within your part of the page because you're isolated from the rest of the application. However, with all things, there are still some downsides to micro front ends. One being that all of these independently built micro front ends that we have, all have their own JS bundles. And sometimes multiple micro front ends may have some similar dependencies. And in that case, each micro front end would have a copy, their own copy of that particular dependency. So you can imagine, if you have, two or three micro front ends on a page that are all in React, all of them will have their own React dependency. So it could be a potential for some performance issues. Another downside is when you do combine all of these micro front ends into that single application or the container application, you might run into some issues that you didn't see before because maybe you were testing just your micro front end in your standalone app. Everything was working good, but once you integrated it with the rest of the microservices, certain things went wrong. Um, to mitigate that type of a risk, it's important that we regularly integrate our micro front ends with the rest of the application so that we can address those types of issues early on. So these were just a few insights and tips on micro front ends and how we can apply them to our projects. Hopefully this information will help you to decide if this is an architecture design that will work for your team. Thank you.